there, Internet people. Welcome back to Green Wing Gaming. Or welcome if you're new. If you're a returning viewer, you already know the drill, but if you're a first-time viewer, first of all, thanks so much for being here, but we're releasing this video on a Monday, and on Mondays, we like to talk about Warhammer stuff. So, if this is your first video that you decide to join us on, you've picked an auspicious occasion, because today we are starting something that I have been really looking forward to since I started the channel. We are starting our first faction focus for Warhammer 40k. And if you understand what the reference to this channel name is, the name of this channel, you might already have a good idea of where we're going to be starting. We are starting with the Dark Angels, my first true love of Warhammer, the Unforgiven, the glorious First Legion of the Adeptus Astartes. The Dark Angels have been my main army for as long as I've been in Warhammer. I started collecting them 20 years ago in 2003, and I haven't looked back. I've been loving them ever since, although, if I'm being honest, the thing that first drew me to them, it wasn't like some big philosophical attachment. It literally was just, my favorite color is green. I wanted to play Space Marines. I wanted ones with green armor. It was the Dark Angels or the Salamanders, and at the time I was a huge King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table nerd, so I picked the Dark Angels, and I've been loving that choice ever since. The more I learn about them, the more I love them. So, and this is my YouTube channel, so I say that they get to go first. But yeah, so what we're going to be doing is breaking down the Dark Angels in 10th edition. This video is going to be covering, like, the bare bones of their lore. We're not going to go huge in-depth on that because there's a lot of it. There's a lot of Dark Angels lore, and that's almost enough to start forget a whole other video, that's almost enough to start a whole other channel. So we're going to cover the real bare bones, get anyone watching this caught up to date on where the Dark Angels are at in, end of 9th, beginning of 10th. And then we're going to talk a little bit about their detachment rules, which, if any of you watching this are already 40k players, you're accustomed to them having like a chapter tactic. Well, in 10th, chapter tactics aren't a thing anymore. They have their own special detachment with detachment rules. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about their lore, and that's going to be this video. And then for the next couple weeks, all of our Monday the next like 3 Monday videos after this one are all going to be talking about Dark Angels still. The next video is going to be talking about their detachment stratagems and enhancements. The video after that is going to be focusing on their Deathwing units, and the video after that is going to be focusing on their Ravenwing units. For you new people, if you don't know much about the Dark Angels, the Deathwing and the Ravenwing are the first and second companies of the Dark Angels chapter. They are highly specialized formations of the Dark Angels, wildly divergent from what most Space Marine chapters do, and their models in-game have a lot of special rules just for them, so I think they kind of warrant their own videos, because otherwise this video would be an hour at least of me talking at the camera, and that'd probably get a little boring, so I'm going to try and cut you guys a break. But this is something I've wanted to talk about for a while, and for those of you wondering why it's not just what I jumped right into, the answer is timing. There was a part of me that really did want to just jump in talking about the Dark Angels, but I did also want to put out a few videos for some of the newcomers to the hobby, and right around the time I was launching the channel, Games Workshop announced 10th edition was coming, and it felt a little ridiculous to spend the time making a faction focus that is not going to be at all helpful to you guys in a month, or like in 2 months, because at time of recording, it's mid-June. 10th edition has more or less launched. All of the rules and points values have been released online for free. Games Workshop suddenly became very pro-consumer for a change. But the actual like data cards are not out yet. The official launch for 10th edition is not here yet. And it just felt a little weird to do faction focuses before we had the rules to look at. So, but now I've had a chance to actually look at the core rulebook, look at the indexes, look at the rules, And I've even had a chance to play 1 or 2 games of 10th edition, so I'm feeling a lot more comfortable talking to you guys about this. But speaking of, I mentioned how this channel started right as 10th edition was getting ready to come out. This channel is still very new at time of recording. I've been doing this for right around 2 months. So at this point, anything you guys can do to engage with this video really helps me out. You've already done me a huge solid by clicking on the video. Literally any number of views is positive for me at this point. If you'd be willing to do me an even bigger favor, watching all the way to the end also really helps. Obviously, hitting the like button, subscribing really helps. We do more of these discussion videos every Monday. We have gameplay videos every Friday. So if you hit that subscribe button, you can join us for more of the fun. And obviously, down in the comments section, I would love to hear what you guys are thinking about the Dark Angels in this new edition. But with all of that self-promotion out of the way, we're talking about Dark Angels in 10th edition, so let's just get into it. Okay, so we're going to start off talking a little bit about the lore of the Dark Angels. And like I said, we're just going to go over like the bare bones. We're not going to get too deep into this, but to understand the kind of backstory behind the Dark Angels, we have to rewind the clock a little bit back to the end of the Horus Heresy, which for those of you who are newer to Warhammer, the Horus Heresy was the giant civil war in the Imperium where half of the Space Marine legions betrayed the Emperor and sided with the forces of chaos and tried to conquer the galaxy. That's what the Horus Heresy was, and that's what literally created what we now know as Chaos Space Marines. During the Horus Heresy, despite what many other people like to joke about, the Dark Angels were in fact a loyalist legion. They fought for the Emperor against the traitors. However, during the history of the Dark Angels, their Primarch, their leader, the Lionel Johnson, had a bit of a falling out with his right-hand man, his number 2 guy, a fellow by the name of Luther. Again, I'm not going to go super into the details of it. Basically, Luther at one point considered he wasn't really going to kill the Lion, but he was considering allowing someone else to succeed in killing him. He ultimately didn't go through with it, but when he confessed what he'd done to the Lion super didn't take it well. And they had a massive falling out. Luther was banished back to the Dark Angels' homeworld and was left there to rot for like hundreds of years. Yeah, and so ultimately this left Luther very vulnerable. He ended up being seduced by the powers of chaos, and so at the end of the Horus Heresy, the traitor Dark Angels that kind of Luther was able to sway over to his side and laid a massive ambush on their homeworld of Caliban, lured the Lion back to their homeworld, and then unleashed a massive bombardment using orbital defense batteries, trying to murder him. Now, ultimately, this ambush did not succeed. The Lion was able to survive, launched a massive counterattack that was so fierce, it literally shattered their homeworld. Like, their homeworld of Caliban just ceased to exist, except for this one massive chunk where the Dark Angels' like main headquarters, their fortress monastery, that was the only part of the planet to survive in any recognizable shape. And so this all ended with the Lion and Luther having a mano-a-mano showdown. They fought each other. The Lion did win, but then Luther was able to do some warp shenanigans because chaos, and was able to kind of mortally wound the Lion in kind of a mini replication of what happened between the Emperor and Horus. But after this, Luther was so overcome with grief at what he had done to his best friend, he kind of went all bibbledy, lost his marbles, and the Chaos Gods were like super unimpressed by his rejection of their murderous impulses. And so they opened up a warp storm right around Caliban and basically scooped up all of the traitor Dark Angels and cast them across space and time so that the loyalist Dark Angels would basically never be able to find them. And so Ever since then, the traitor Dark Angels have been referred to as the Fallen, and the Dark Angels have made it their personal mission to track down every single fallen angel and force them to repent for their transgressions against the Primarch. Now, ultimately, the Dark Angels, up until recently, believed the Lion to be dead. They believed he was gone forever, and they've kind of been locked into this generational grieving for their lost world, their lost Primarch. It's actually surprisingly emotionally in-depth if you start to look at it, or if you start to overanalyze it the way I do. But basically, they hunt after the fallen angels, and when they find them, there's kind of one of two options. Option number one, the Fallen immediately admits to his wrongdoing and apologizes, at which point the Dark Angels shoot him in the head and kill him. Or option number two, the Fallen refuses to admit that he did anything wrong, at which point the interrogator chaplains brutally torture him until he does admit he did something wrong, and then they kill him. So it's all very dark, and it's all very indicative of a legion that is becoming slowly psychologically twisted by their own grief. Which I just find that a wonderfully nuanced backstory to they're doing some messed up stuff, but you can kind of understand where they're coming from, but that doesn't make it any better. It's a lot more, there's a lot more depth there than in a lot of other Space Marine backstories. But in terms of where the lore stands right now, the end of 9th edition brought about some pretty momentous changes for the Dark Angels. For one thing, the Lion woke up. Kind of the deepest secret that even the Dark Angels were not aware of was that the Lion has spent this whole time basically, hibernating inside the deepest dungeons of the Forest Monastery. There's these weird little Jawa creatures, kind of these warp entities known as the Watchers in the Dark, that kind of, they were native to the planet Caliban and have been watching over the Dark Angels, basically for as long as they've existed. And in particular, they were looking after the Lion. And so the Lion has been kind of sheltered by the Watchers in this hidden chamber at the heart of the Dark Angels' fortress, which has been turned into this massive space station. That basically, it's this giant fortress, like a castle, like a medieval castle on unbelievable proportions, sitting on top of a kind of cone of bedrock, and the Dark Angels literally fitted engines to it, and docking bays and shield generators and all that stuff that you need to turn it into basically a giant traveling space station, which I think is just super cool. They literally turned a fragment of a planet into a giant space station that travels around the galaxy. Which is pretty cool. And so the Lion has been hiding within the heart of this the hidden chamber at the very center of this fortress. And the big thing that happened at the end of 9th was he came back. The Watchers in the Dark finally woke him up, and the part where it gets a little, I don't want to say lame, but honestly kind of lame, is that Games Workshop spent literally 4 editions, all from 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th edition. They were teasing, hey, the Lion is hiding at the heart of the rock, and he's going to come back when the Dark Angels need him the most. And then when they woke him up, he somehow just escapes from the rock, from their fortress, without anyone noticing, which feels a little, it doesn't feel great. I personally was not super happy with that lore twist, but whatever. I don't write the lore, it's fine. And so the Dark Angels were lured into a trap by a demon known as Vashtor the Archifane. This was kind of part of the big lore books that were being released at the end of 9th edition. This demon called Vashtor lured the Dark Angels into a trap and was ambushing them, and that's when the Lion, for some reason joined by the Blood Angels, again, not really sure what they were thinking with this, but he linked up with some Blood Angels and brought a bunch of fallen Dark Angels to come save the Dark Angels. Basically, the whole thing is that the Lion has developed this strange power called forest walking, where he basically opens up like his own little pocket webway portal through the warp, and he's able to kind of travel around the galaxy almost like the Eldar do with their webway portals, and so is able to jump around that way. And he's been using that to run around the galaxy, finding the fallen Dark Angels, and trying to regain their loyalty, trying to redeem them, and rather than just killing them, he actually tries to, like, bring them back to his side and redeem them and say, hey, it's okay, you know, we can try to repair this. And oddly enough, I'm actually totally okay with that part. I'm not crazy about him just, like, leaving the rock without anyone noticing. I'm not crazy about him meeting up with the Blood Angels before he meets up with the Dark Angels. That felt a little weird and like a random kind of snub to the Dark Angels in their own story. But the part where he is trying to redeem the Fallen, I'm actually super on board with. Because him leading a campaign of bloody vengeance, it's kind of the obvious choice. This felt a little more nuanced and felt more like he's taking accountability for his own part in what happened, kind of recognizing that it, you know, if he was half as brilliant as he thought he was, how was he not able to understand that cracking down so hard on Luther would eventually push him to treason? And so it's kind of a thing of trying to take accountability for his own actions, and thus redeem at least some of the Fallen. Now, crucially, he does not redeem all of them. There are some fallen Dark Angels that they're too far gone. They are fully enmeshed in the whole chaos gods, magic, warp stuff, and as far as he's concerned, the only fate for them is death. But even there, he takes kind of a Ned Stark Game of Thrones approach of he should personally be the one to behead them. He should be the one personally killing them, kind of taking on the burden of fixing his own mistakes. And so I'm super on board with that aspect of the modern lore. I'm really liking what they've done with his data sheet. I'm loving what they've done with his lore of what his personal motivations are. Again, the circumstances were not great, but I'm not going to throw too much of a tantrum about that. And so that is where the lore currently stands at the end of 9th and beginning of 10th edition. I don't know a whole lot about what happened after he saved the Dark Angels from their big ambush. I know he showed up, he defeated Angron in a big 1v1 fight, and then he led the Dark Angels out of the ambush and they were able to escape. Other than that, I'm not really sure what happened. I haven't been able to find anything of what happened after they escaped the ambush. So I'm assuming that's coming in future lore updates. But until then, we'll just have to wait and see. So with that all being said, consider this a big demarcation point. This is where we've reached the end of the lore segment. I hope I was able to keep it relatively cogent for you guys. I hope it wasn't too confusing. I know Warhammer lore can be a little dense, and kind of, to learn one piece of lore, you have to know 3 other pieces of lore. It can get a little confusing, but I hope I did an okay job of explaining it to you guys. So now, real quick before we go, I'm just going to run by the new 10th edition detachment ability for the Dark Angels. Now, for those of you who have been playing for a while, you're used to something called chapter tactics. As I mentioned in the intro, chapter tactics are not a thing anymore. You derive all of your army-specific rules from your detachment. So if you're playing with, like, just generic Space Marines, if you're playing with, like, if you're playing as, like, Ultramarines, Imperial Fists, White Scars, all that stuff, you use a detachment called a Gladius Strike Force. Now, again, I'm not crazy about that, because it means that, like, there's literally no difference between White Scars, Raven Guard, Imperial Fist. They're all fundamentally the same, because they only have that one detachment for all of them. And so there's no unique chapter abilities, and I think I personally am not a fan. But that's just my personal opinion. I'm going to try not to weigh you down with that. So, but for the more divergent, aka the more popular more popular Space Marine detachments, more popular Space Marine chapters. Sorry, got a little tongue-tied there. But like like the Space Wolves, the Blood Angels, Death Watch, and Dark Angels, they all get their own specific detachments. Again, this feels like kind of a massive middle finger to some of the other chapters, because like the Ultramarines, like Space Marines, Space Marines, but literally the Ultramarines get their own detachment that everybody else has to share. But then the Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, they all get their own separate cool one, which, again, feels like a little unfair, but whatever. So as for what is the actual, like, army rule when you're using this detachment? So the Dark Angels detachment is known as an Unforgiven Task Force. And so if you're running the Unforgiven Task Force, the ability that you get, if you're running the Gladius Strike Force, you get combat doctrines. You get the tactical, devastator, and assault doctrines that all have like once per game abilities. For the Unforgiven Task Force, you get a different rule. I'm gonna go ahead and give you some spoilers. The new rule is objectively worse than the Gladius Strike Force. The combat doctrines are really powerful. They're really good. The Unforgiven Task Force, literally all it does is you lose the combat doctrines, and instead you have a thing that says if you fail a battle shock check, instead of having your objective control stat reduced to 0, it goes down to 1. That's it. That's all it does. Don't get me wrong, that can be super niche. It can be really helpful that if you're in a situation where your opponent is trying to shoot you off an objective in the hopes that you'll fail a battle shock check and thus, you'll have no objective control and you won't be scoring that objective. Well, because you're a Dark Angel, well, there's no reason for him to do that because, okay, I'll still have an OC stat and I'll still, be able to hold the objective. I get it. It can be situationally very useful, but that's the key word. It is situationally useful. I'm really not a fan of the fact that Space Marines have a really good leadership stat, so already they're not super likely to fail a battle shock check. And if you don't, then your detachment ability does literally nothing. It only becomes relevant if you fail a battle shock check, which you're probably not going to do because you're a Space Marine. Yeah, I'm really not sure what the thought process was here. I'm not a fan of rules that only work under a somewhat unlikely series of events. That seems really unfair. But to be fair, in a situation that's not fair, the Dark Angels were like really strong in 9th to the point where a lot of people thought they were super broken. I don't agree with that. I do agree they were powerful. Didn't think they were broken. But, a lot of times when your army is strong in one edition, in the next edition, they're going to be garbage. So maybe that's just what it is. That might just be our cross to bear in 10th edition. If so, oh well, it's not that big a deal. I'm still going to be running Dark Angels because I still love their units. But we're not going to be talking about that right now. We're going to be talking about that in a future video. So, in the meantime, in future videos, we're going to dive into a little bit more of what the Unforgiven Task Force has to offer. Again, spoiler alert, it's not as good as the Gladius Strike Force. But you get to use specific Dark Angel units, which you could argue are really good, and thus it does kind of make up for it. But anyways, we'll be talking more about that in subsequent videos. In the meantime, I really appreciate you guys watching all the way to the end. If you made it this far, you've really helped me out. And I hope there was something in here that you found interesting, something that you found informative. Let me know what you think of the Unforgiven Task Force down below. What do you think about the new lore? What do you think about the new detachment? What are your thoughts? I would love to hear it in the comments down below. I would love to see you guys over on the next videos or some of the ones I've already uploaded. In the meantime, I would love to hear what you guys have to say, but in the meantime, happy wargaming.
Onward to glory!